Story 1. My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small, owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's coworkers, I'll call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a long-time nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Jane was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours pay by supposedly going into the office in her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on a number of occasions and being warned about trying to claim for unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane had actually been fired from her previous job at another local travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try with her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off, if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite, no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come in to work on the weekend or after hours in order to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 work days just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee both verbally and in writing that they could not book time off for the dates in question since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that, only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas, as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the dates Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself and her daughter, Sandy emailed Jane telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she had already been told they were unavailable because Sandy would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply, without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie, that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years, and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that without making any mention of Jane's threat to quit retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so, let her finish out her 2 weeks, or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early, accompanied by her longtime partner to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards which had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work, and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9 o'clock, acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a good morning as she walked through the door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's partner seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire." Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice, and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinance, and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's partner had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she didn't leave, they would have to call the RCMP Canadian Police, at which point Sandy's partner dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at Zai's travel agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Jane immediately ran to the door ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client info. In order to de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client info. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding on to her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane, and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Jane's wounds, the next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business congratulating Jane on her retirement, and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the piece of revenge cake was Sandy, when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, retires, made sure to check the box labeled retired for for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. Story 2. Since some people seem to get the wrong impression as to why I did all those other things to my mother as payback. She's extremely narcissistic, blatantly favored my sister to the point of letting her get away with anything she did to me unless my father got involved. Hit me as hard as she could to the point I couldn't even sit down for no reason on several occasions. Would snap her fingers and order me around like a dog. Let my sister steal money I earned from doing chores and odd jobs around the area, and took her on shopping sprees with said money. Tried to send me to military school behind my father's back, when I refused to let her beat me anymore. And more recently tried to force me to give the house I inherited from my now deceased father to my pregnant sister. This story happened over 15 years ago, just before I moved out of my mom's house during my parents' divorce. She'd been extra callous to me during that time, and I wanted some payback, so I did several petty pranks to her and my sister around the house before I moved in with my dad, many of which I've posted about. But by this time, I was running out of ideas, though I had one in particular that I was saving for last. My mother, aside from her love of wine, also brewed a homemade alcoholic honey lemon iced tea that she just loved to guzzle, especially on Friday evenings after work. She kept a pitcher of it in the fridge that she refilled every so often, and the night she was so drunk she passed out in the hall and soiled herself gave me an idea. I went to a drug store that was across town where nobody knew me and found a small bottle of potent liquid laxative that was odorless, tasteless, and mixed with any beverage. And I pretended to be very constipated at the register just for the sake of acting. When I got home, I carefully removed the same amount of tea from the pitcher and then poured the whole bottle of laxative into Mom's special iced tea, added a tiny bit more sugar, and stirred it up. From that point, all I had to do was wait. That evening after Mom came home from work, she went to the fridge and poured herself a big and tall glass of her special home-brewed iced tea. She downed the first one pretty quick on the spot and then refilled it. Then she just sat watching TV on the sofa, which was white leather BTW. I watched as she started shuffling about, and even heard a loud gurgling noise at one point. But she kept drinking the tea. I pretended to be concerned and asked if she was okay since she looked like she was sweating and couldn't sit still. Mom stubbornly played it off, and then suddenly winced as one of the most horrid sounds I've ever heard came out of her backside. She screamed, "Oh God, no!" dropped what was left of the glass of tea and ran for the bathroom. She'd soiled herself so hard some of it went through her clothes and onto the couch. My mom ran into the master bathroom and started wailing as she took the biggest dump of her life. If anyone here knows that bathroom scene from the movie Dumb and Dumber, it was a lot like that crossed with a certain funny scene from the first tack and the Power of Juju video game. Mom didn't come out of the bathroom for over 2 hours, and when she finally did, she was wearing her bathrobe because she'd just taken a shower. Her hair was a mess and she looked completely flushed. I'd cleaned up the mess she made on the couch, but she insisted on having the couch professionally cleaned, which was fine with me because that was her favorite spot to sit in the living room, and she refused to sit there till the couch was cleaned the way she'd wanted. But then the funny thing is, she actually poured herself another glass of the iced tea, and that wound her right back in the bathroom. And she even took the tea with her. She was literally feeding the fire. After that, she didn't come out again and had an absolutely miserable night. Thank God my dad was sleeping at a motel because he was divorcing Mom. The master bathroom was connected to the master bedroom, and the smell downstairs had me and my sister gagging. The next day, Mom felt so bad that she called in to take leave from work for the next few days because her bowels were going crazy and she got no sleep. Just to be safe, I checked the pitcher to see how much tea was left, and it was nearly gone, so I figured I was in the clear. But then here's the other crazy thing. The next day at school, my sister nearly soiled herself in class and had to run for the girls' room, then asked to be sent home sick because of diarrhea. Apparently she'd been sneaking some of Mom's special iced tea because it had alcohol in it, and smuggled what was left in the pitcher to school with her in a thermos. This clued my mom in that there was something wrong with the tea, and had me thoroughly wash the pitcher and throw away the various ingredients she used to make it, because she was afraid the pitcher or the tea ingredients were somehow contaminated. My sister also got in trouble for stealing alcohol. I'd almost never seen my mom chew out my sister for being bad, but this was one of those rare times. She said she was grounded and sent her to her room crying. But of course she immediately forgave her the next day and just told her not to do it again, which as far as I know she didn't. I was smart enough not to dispose of the laxative bottle in the trash at our house or keep it in my room. I tossed it the same day I used it at a random trash can while out riding my bike, and when I bought it I was wearing an old coat, hat and sunglasses, so likely no one recognized me. I told my father years later that I was the one responsible for what happened back then, and he started cackling. He said I shouldn't have done it, but it was just too funny not to laugh at. My sister also knows about what I did now, as I told her before writing this story. She said she doesn't care because it was a long time ago and taught her a lesson not to try and steal booze anyway. My mother still doesn't know it was me, and my sister and I don't plan on ever telling her. Story 3. A little bit of background to help. I'm a U.S. Marine who was recently stationed in Okinawa, Japan. So when you get stationed overseas, especially in Japan, there's a specific process to get everyone where they need to go with regards to flights. Basically everyone and their families get put in flights to Seattle International Airport. Once there, it's usually an uncomfortable 12 hours of families and service members sleeping on floors throughout the terminal, and USO to wait for the 2 MSA screening and pre-flight check-in for the 7-8 M flights. The flights from Seattle are traditionally government-contracted flights, so it's only military personnel and their families, and the planes only stop at military bases from there. So fast forward to the very first stop, mainland Japan. 15 hours of flying later, my wife and I, and my service dog Zoe, get off the plane along with all the other military families and pets. It's been a long flight. Everyone is irritated and grumpy and just wants to get everything over with. We have 2 more stops at different bases to let people off. Enter Entitled Mother. Entitled Mother exits the plane with everyone else at our first stop. We have to sit in a staging area because, seeing as we are now in another country, we can't go anywhere without going through customs. Entitled Mother begins to loudly complain that the environment is not comfortable enough and that the air is too humid. Wow. In Okinawa, who would have guessed? At this point, she's just being generally annoying, but everyone ignores her. We all boarded the plane no problem. We all really just want to leave and get to our final bases. Fast forward to our second stop, around 2 hours of flying later. Still on the mainland, but closer to Okinawa, as we taxi towards our next stop at the terminal to drop people off. I get a Snapchat from a Marine who used to work for me. He's on the runway and there's like 3-4 other planes with families behind us. It's pouring rain, but they're going to let us off the plane to stretch out legs again, while some of the families actually depart. Everyone stands up and gets ready to get off the plane when the pilot comes on the intercom and says we all have to be seated again. No explanation. I message my friend on the flight line and ask him if he knows what's going on. He says that the departing families have exited the plane, but that a spouse still on board was causing a problem. He comes up to the plane and I walk up to the front to greet him. Haven't seen him in 7 months. I begin to ask him what is going on. Re-enter Entitled Mother. Entitled Mother is talking to the flight attendants along with a sergeant and staff sergeant. Her son, around 4 or 5 years old, had air sickness. Nothing more, just a little nausea and a headache. Entitled Mother, but he's not feeling good and he needs to see a doctor. Now, he can't breathe. Staff Sergeant, ma'am, we've already had him looked at by a corpsman, a Navy medic for Marines. He's fine. We can just grab him some Advil or Tylenol for his headache and he'll be fine. Entitled Mother, no, he has swollen glands, see? She starts jabbing the kid in his neck with her bony fingers at this point. We're not leaving this plane until he receives medical attention. That's it. The staff sergeant makes eye contact with me and my friend and just sighs and rolls his eyes. He can't even finish saying "ma'am" before she has an outburst over seeing this. Entitled mother, I'm sorry. Is something wrong with me caring for my son? Get him a doctor. Now. Staff sergeant, ma'am. It's after working hours, it's around 6:30 p.m. All official medical staff have gone home already. If we want to get him extra attention, I will have to call the emergency landing crew, shut down the runway, and have paramedics take a look at him. And that's just out of the question. You are not the only person on this flight, and your son is not the only person not feeling well. He will be fine. At this point, entitled mother explodes and just keeps demanding that they shut down the entire flight line for her crazy self. Staff sergeant goes back and forth with her for a while, and my friend and I laugh as I shake his hand and go back to my seat. At this point, we're now 2 hours behind schedule thanks to this one person, but a 2-hour delay for us backs up the planes behind us even more. She finally takes her seat, and we take off for another hour flight to our final stop, Okinawa. We land, and she immediately starts up again, going on about how she's going to have their jobs and get them all punished and demoted. Everyone is ignoring her. My wife and I happen to be right behind her when she finally gets off the plane after berating the flight attendants at the front of the plane again. We get to the bottom of the stairs, and she immediately turns to a random spouse and goes, "Wow. Not even my first day on the island, and I'm already almost arrested. Off to a great start. Who knew being an Air Force wife would be so difficult? I really wish they had tried. They would not have had fun." I look at her airman husband, and he's just standing there trying to hide himself, ashamed of her at this point, as she then starts to harass the airmen on airport security duty. A few minutes of her nagging the security officer about God knows what. I heard him say in a very loud, commanding voice, "Ma'am, there's nothing to be done about your issue on the basis that it is not an issue. Please leave before I'm forced to take action." Her response to that, spitting in his face. The other officer immediately tells her she's under arrest for assaulting a military officer, and moves to put the shiny cuffs on her. She kinda manifested her arrest, lol. We were the last plane scheduled to land on base in Okinawa that night. Thanks to this single woman, the entire staff at the airport had to stay longer, the customs officials had to stay longer, the flight maintenance crew had to stay longer, along with the same exact staff for all the other airports for the 3-4 planes that were behind us at the last airport. Story 4. This happened about 5 years ago. I was working part-time at Ace Hardware. I had semi-retired the year before, so I just wanted to work part-time to keep busy. I had gotten off of work and headed towards the local Walmart, where my wife was working, to pick her up after she had finished work. I had gone into the store to pick up a few things instead of just waiting in the car. I was wearing khakis and a light blue polo with the big Ace logo on the left chest side. Also wearing black shoes. Being that I was the paint specialist, I wore different colored polos instead of the usual red ones worn by Ace employees. As I was going by the hardware area headed towards the auto area, I heard, "Ace is the place," which, when I looked over, came from we will call him Joe, a Wally World employee who was behind the paint desk. I knew Joe, we met a few times when I was shopping with my wife, so we knew each other. Joe was trying to help a customer of his, but was having some trouble. Joe had worked in the hardware department area for around 6 months and was a real good kid who wanted to learn, and I have worked in the paint, home improvement, hardware, etc. fields for 38 years. Joe asked me politely if I could help. The customer asked his questions. I gave answers as well as helpful hints on how to do his project. The customer got what he needed, thanked me and Joe, and went on his way. Joe thanked me and asked if the wife was getting off soon, to which I replied in about 10 minutes. We chatted for a few minutes, and then I went over to Auto to get the wipers I needed. Walmart has that little computer thing where you punch in all the information, make, model, etc., and it will tell you what you need. I found one 21-inch wiper and was digging through the mess looking for another when I heard the dreaded, "Excuse me, I turned to look and found, standing next to me, the typical Karen. Karen's hairstyle, her huge sunglasses, she was in her 40s, dressed way too nice to be shopping in a Walmart, and with enough gold chains to make Mr. T jealous. All the cast of characters are as follows. Paint guy me, Karen. Joe, the good Walmart employee, one of the Walmart managers, Walmart security, Cop 1 and Cop 2. Karen, you took your sweet time helping that customer in paints, so now you will help me. I need wipers for my BMW. Me, trying to be nice. If you don't know how to use the computer here, I can show you. No, you will get them for me. That's why you work in this dump, so you do your job. I don't work here, lady. Yes, you do. You are helping the man in paint, and you are wearing the uniform. Pointing to my chest pocket, I say, does this say Ace Hardware or Walmart? Ignoring my pointing, she says, you will get me what I want, or I will get your manager and get you fired. At that point, I had enough of her nonsense. I grabbed my second wiper, turned, and started to walk away. She then started to scream. Where do you think you are going? Get back here. Where is your manager? I am getting you fired. A few seconds after the word fired came out of her volcano lips, I felt a hand grab my left shoulder and dagger-like nails dig into my skin in my upper chest area. Note: back in 2001, I was diagnosed with sarcoma cancer, which was in my upper left chest area. They removed all of the cancer, muscle, and whatever padding I had, and all that was left was a thin layer of skin. Her nails pierced the skin, and I yelped. I grabbed her wrist with my right hand, squeezed her wrist hard, and yanked her hand off of me. As I turned to face her, I pushed her away from me. She stumbled backwards and fell against the counter and then her buttocks. She is sitting on the floor, screaming that I attacked her. At this time, Joe came around the aisle. I yelled at Joe to get a manager and security. I then opened my polo and put my right hand in to check, as my chest hurt. Yep, I was bleeding. She had torn the skin. I grabbed some tissues to put them in place. At that time, one of the managers and the security came running over. Manager, what is going on here? Karen, your employee attacked me. Karen was helped to her feet by the manager and security. Which employee? Him, pointing at Joe. Karen, no, him, pointing at me. He doesn't work here. He works for Ace Hardware, as per his shirt. I want him fired. I want him arrested. I am going to sue. In the meantime, the security guard came over and was talking to me. I told him what happened, and I think that they should call the cops. He also called the emergency medical technicians, as the tissue I was using was now blood-soaked. Karen is still screaming. Karen, I want him fired. I want him arrested. He assaulted me. He tried to do things against my will. She just kept going on and on. She was yelling down the aisle at me, as well as the security guy and the one manager. The security told Joe to get me a chair as well as a bunch of towels, and also try to get a hold of my wife as well. After about 10 minutes, 2 cops came in. Cop #1 went to talk with Karen, who kept adding more crimes against her. It seems not only I beat her up, then tried to do stuff against her will, and then stole her purse. Cop #2 came to talk to me. By this time, the emergency medical technicians and my wife were with me. My shirt was off, my upper chest was bloody, and trails ran down my stomach and were starting to stain my khakis. The manager and security were with Karen. The emergency medical technicians and my wife were with me. The cops were in the middle of the island talking. Cop #1 called over the security guard and asked to see security footage. The 2 went off. Karen got really quiet when security cameras were mentioned. After about 10 minutes, the emergency medical technicians were finishing up and wanted to take me to the hospital, which I declined. Cop #1 and the security guard came back and came over to me. The look on Karen's face with that smile made her feel like she won. The cops, in low voices, asked me if I wanted to press charges, to which I said yes. They both turned and headed towards Karen, and when the one cop pulled out his cuffs, she screamed, "Arrest him, not me," and threw her purse at Cop-1 and hit him in the face. She turned and started to run, but Cop-2 did a flying tackle and took her to the floor and had her cuffed in under a minute. She was charged with assault, giving a false police report, assaulting a police officer, resisting arrest, etc. I myself had to have my arm in a sling for several weeks so that it would heal. I had to wear this gooey-covered gauze while it did. Story 5. A person I used to work with a few years ago experienced this story firsthand, though it didn't happen directly to me. We were both employed as system consultants, a role that required us to travel to client sites during critical project phases that necessitated in-person assistance. Since the travel expenses for these trips impacted the project's budget or were billed to the client, we were encouraged to travel light and plan thoroughly, choosing reasonable fares and avoiding excessive spending on accommodations and meals. Most of the time, this strategy worked effectively. If anything unusual arose, a quick call explaining the circumstances typically resolved the issue, and our expenses would be approved so we could proceed without delays. However, everything changed when our company was contracted by a particular client whose operations seemed detached from typical business norms. Despite the odd environment, our standard cost-conscious policy still applied, and the client's financial controller emphasized that they would not approve our expenses unless we were exceptionally mindful of costs. This applied to both our company and my colleague, who was a directly hired contractor. Eventually, we scheduled our first in-person meeting. To keep expenses low, we booked the most affordable flights without checked luggage and arrived in attire that included button-down shirts, dark pants, and black slip-on shoes. This choice of clothing, while not overly formal, was perfectly acceptable to every other client we had worked with so far. But not for this client. We were pulled aside and informed that the top-level management was dismayed that their service provider had not shown up in formal suits, polished shoes, and freshly ironed shirts. While I was taken aback, my contractor colleague remained calm and simply requested a brief email detailing the requirements for formal suits, ironed shirts, and dress shoes. Surprisingly, the client complied with his request. On our next trip, things got interesting when I coordinated travel plans with my colleague to ensure similar flight schedules and the same accommodations. First, we booked flights the evening before, allowing us to arrive fully prepared. Second, we had to check our luggage. Lastly, our usual no-frills hotel, which was slightly farther from the client's office, was no longer adequate. Given the client's preference for formal, unwrinkled attire, we had to bring checked luggage to fit 2 suits and a fresh shirt for each day, plus a spare. Since ironing would be necessary, we booked a business hotel downtown that offered ironing facilities. Additionally, the time spent ironing was factored into our invoices, at least for my contractor colleague. Skipping over the uneventful meeting, the story gets interesting when our company's invoice and the contractor's expense claim were both denied. We pointed out that the formal dress was specified in the client's own email, arguing that this additional expense was a direct result of their request. Yet, the controller remained inflexible. Frustrated, the contractor immediately stopped working with the client and informed my management, recommending that I do the same. After the client missed a project deadline and a few remote meetings, each declined with a polite reminder of the unpaid invoice, the controller finally yielded. The top-level management dropped the formal dress code, and we parted ways with the client as soon as our contract ended. Since then, I've received a message from the client's team through a professional networking platform attempting to recruit me. Quite the amusing turn of events.